Welcome back to the Global Ledger. I'm Justin. Most people are taught a very clean story that the US was on the gold standard until 1971, and then President Nixon suddenly took us off. Sometimes the story goes further, that this decision was sinister, that it was ideological, or that it marked the moment money became fake. It's a powerful story, but it's also wrong. Not because gold doesn't matter, not because discipline doesn't matter, but because a system people imagine didn't exist anymore by 1971, and hadn't for a long time. In fact, the United States left gold before, and it went back more than once. Let's get into it. Today's episode isn't just about Nixon. It's about history and a pattern that keeps repeating. Let's start in the 1860s. Okay, 1860s. Before the Civil War, the U.S. operated on a metallic standard. Gold and silver backed currency. Convertibility mattered. Then the war began. Wars are, well, they're expensive. The federal government faced a choice. Raise taxes dramatically. A. B. Borrow at crushing rates. Or C. Suspend gold convertibility. So in 1862, the U.S. issued greenbacks, paper currency, not redeemable in gold. This wasn't done secretly or maliciously. It was done because the survival of the state required liquidity. Gold didn't disappear, but it stopped being the binding constraint. And crucially, this suspension was understood as temporary. So after the war, the U.S. made a deliberate decision to return to gold. That return wasn't painless. Prices fell, debt burdens rose, economic stress followed, especially for farmers and debtors. The lesson was subtle but important. Going off gold during crisis is easier than going back on. Restoring convertibility requires real economic sacrifice. Still, the U.S. did it, which already tells us something important. Leaving gold does not automatically mean abandoning discipline. So let's fast forward to the 1930s. The U.S. was back on gold. Convertibility existed, and the system broke again. During the Great Depression, banks failed, credit collapsed, and deflation really intensified. Gold constrained the response. So once again, convertibility was suspended. Gold was revalued. Domestic gold redemption was prohibited. This wasn't ideological or sinister or anything of that nature. It was mechanical. Gold prevented the system from stabilizing itself, so it was overridden. After World War II, the world tried something new. And this was Bretton Woods, okay? But it wasn't a return to gold. Bretton Woods is often described as a gold standard. It wasn't. Under Bretton Woods, private citizens could not redeem dollars for gold. Only foreign central banks could. And only really under specific conditions, okay? Gold was no longer everyday money. It was a settlement reference between governments. The dollar became the system's operating currency, and embedded inside that system was a contradiction. The truth of the matter is the system outgrew gold. As global trade expanded, the world needed more dollars. But U.S. gold reserves did not expand with demand. Foreign dollar claims grew larger than the gold available to redeem them. So by the 1960s, convertibility existed mostly on paper, emergency measures were already in place, and confidence was eroding. The system wasn't failing morally; it was failing arithmetically. What happened in 1971 then? When Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, he didn't end a functioning gold standard. He closed a promise that could no longer be kept, was already being rationed, and threatened global instability. This wasn't unprecedented. It was the third major suspension of gold convertibility in U.S. history. The difference this time was simple. The system didn't go back. So, and the reason this was is because the global economy had grown too large. I think it's important to bring in what happened to U.S. banks after this 1971. At this point, a reasonable question would come up in this regard. And that is, if closing the gold window preserved the global system, which is what it did, why did the U.S. domestic banking system struggle so badly afterward? And to add on to that question, didn't banks suffer, because of this move? And the answer is yes, it did, absolutely. But not for the reason most people think. The problem wasn't the absence of gold. The problem was that the U.S. banks had been built for a world that no longer existed. So for decades, the domestic banking system operated under capped or fixed interest rates, low and stable inflation, limited competition for deposits, and predictable funding costs. Banks and saving institutions loaded up on long-duration, fixed-rate assets, assuming rates would remain low. Then the 1970s arrived. Inflation surged. Market interest rates rose sharply. And suddenly the system's asset liability structure broke. Depositors could earn higher yields elsewhere, but banks were trapped holding low yield assets. Funding fled and margins really collapsed. So this wasn't a gold problem. It was an interest rate regime problem. And it would have happened with or without gold, because gold could not stop inflation once the system had already outgrown it. The domestic banking crisis that followed weren't proof that leaving gold was wrong. They were proof that the old banking model could not survive the new monetary environment. So why does this myth of 71 persist? And I think the myth survives because it offers a clear villain, a clear turning point, and a simple explanation. But monetary systems do not fail overnight. They strain, they adapt, they break quietly and then formally as well. So gold isn't abandoned once. It's suspended when it stops working, again and again. What replaced gold? Constraint didn't disappear after gold. It moved from metal to balance sheets, institutional credibility, policy frameworks, and market structure. The system became more flexible, and stability became something that had to be engineered, not assumed. That's why modern finance relies on standing facilities, rate corridors, and liquidity backstops, not gold bars. I think it's so important for people to understand this, because if you can understand it, or at least get some grasp of it, it will allow you to see the future maybe a little bit more clear. So the United States didn't betray gold in 1971. It followed a pattern it had already followed before, suspending the constraint when survival or stability required it. Gold worked when the system was small. It failed when the system scaled. That doesn't make gold, doesn't make it evil. It makes it limited. And once you see that, I think the fear fades a little bit and the conversation becomes much more interesting. I want to thank you for listening to our first myth-busting episode. This is the first of the series, and I thought it would be good to frame in right after episode 55 as we talk about monetary policy and things of that nature. So thank you for listening. And if it helped reframe how you think about money, history, instability, there are many more in the series that are coming up. So please stay tuned and share it with somebody you think might either completely disagree or agree or just interested in possibly a different view. Once again, I'm Justin, and thanks for being here.